and welcome back to the channel. I am your host Muriel, and in today's video I'm going to do a, pretty salty, but hopefully not too rambly review of This Is How You Lose the Time War, co-written by Amal El-Motar and Max Gladstone. This short epistolary novel is marketed as a science-fictional and lesbian, or more generally queer romance, and thus isn't something I'd normally pick up, but they were selling it at Worldcon last August, and I was like, why not? It's short, very short, it is a novella, and I want to buy shiny books because I'm high on happy convention feels. Unfortunately for me, it turned out to be not only a waste of time and money, but one of the worst things I read in 2024. The plot of this book honestly doesn't really matter, but still, here's a basic idea of the premise. So the story, such as it is, revolves around two female characters named Red and Blue, hence the cardinal and American bluebird on the cover, who both come from the very far future, or rather parallel strands of it, and who are both super smart special agents working for the governing factions of said futures. These two factions are locked in a time war with one another, sending agents back in time and across uncountable strands of history to ensure their ultimate dominion in the far future. That's how I understood it at any rate, because the world building in this thing isn't exactly good or all that important, but more on that later. So you have two special agents going a time traveling, divided by political allegiance, and, well, they eventually come to respect, befriend, sort of, then love each other through messages they leave one another across what I'm going to call the multi-timeverse. Now, I'm principally going to structure this review around positives and negatives, chiefly because I mostly have comments regarding the latter, which will focus almost entirely on the book's world-building and romance plot. The former, for their part, almost entirely revolve around the book's writing style and basic premise, which I found interesting, although I can't say I found it that interesting either, if I'm being honest. But so yes, starting on a positive note, I enjoyed the book's prose for the most part. It was rather lovely at times. There's a caveat I'll come back to, and I could feel something and vibe, shall we say, with the excitement and related yearning the characters felt from finally meeting and then connecting with a kindred spirit over time and space through the written word. Or the encoded word, since our protagonists don't always leave each other letters in the traditional sense of the word, but rather bits of scored bark, arranged bones, bits of glass, etc. Whatever steganographic means are at their disposal. Yes, I learned that word because of this book, so I'll give it that. I found that aspect of the story pleasant overall, if a little bittersweet, given my personal experience with that sort of thing. That being said, given the nature of this book's romance, the prose also, unfortunately, veered into slightly over-the-top cringe territory in places. Now, I've written love letters as a teenager and as an adult. I love very fucking intensely. I'm a capital R romantic at heart, but there's being earnestly, lovingly soulful, and then there's being, well, puppy dog cringe, which is fine when you're a teenager, but much less so when you're supposed to be a super advanced, very far future post-human. Now sure, your mileage will absolutely 1,000,000,000% vary here on where the line resides with this exactly, but for me, it was certainly fascinating, not to say whiplashing, to go through one of Red, or was it Blue's, not that it matters, letters, messages, what have you, and realize it both contained inspiring yet believable poetic sentiments of love, and sentences worthy of an inflamed 16-year-old. That was certainly not to my personal preference, and I'll leave it at that, but then it was also just a function of the romance as a whole, which I'll get back to very shortly, in conjunction with the world building. And I guess a function of the character work, or rather its absence, given there was relatively little of it to speak of. Red and Blue are post-humans, okay. One was kind of like a cyborg, the other was kind of like a plant person, was my best guess at any rate, and they're both women, if that even means anything in the context of these post-humans, but I'll get back to that. They're both super smart and both feel at odds with their respective factions, and so they basically bond over that. But at the end of the day, Red and Blue could have been clones of each other, given the two similar ways they acted, talked, thought, and felt about things, and then the story kind of reinforced that, but again, I'll get back to that. I enjoyed their intellectual banter at first, because again, I could kind of relate, but outside of that, they mostly felt like extra nerdy AIs rather than individuals, which you could argue scores a point in favor of them feeling like post-humans rather than human stricto sensu, but then, A, why would that give me a reason to give a shit about their stupid leading romance? And B, you can in fact give personality to AI constructs or non-human entities in fiction in a way that makes it a lot more believable and engaging than what I got in this novella. A good example of this for me being some of the AIs you get in Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos. So yeah, this was a fail for me. I didn't give a single crap about Red, Blue, their goals, or their romance. And now I can get into the ranty meat of it. I'll try and progress through my points in a way that keeps the world-building and romance plot as distinct as possible, but ultimately, they're intertwined. I'll also do my best not to go into plot spoilers until the end of this section, and I'll clearly mark it with timestamps and such. As already stated, I found the story's basic premise somewhat interesting. Sure, I'll admit that. Unfortunately, the execution of said premise was severely lacking, and that immediately leads me to my biggest gripe with this book. Why in the hell did it actually need to be science fiction at all? I ask this because the science fictional qualities of this story were majorly underdeveloped and underutilized, not to say wasted, in terms of meaningful world building and in terms of broader imaginative storytelling. And most definitely in terms of theming, since I have nothing substantive, much less interesting to say about the book with regards to that. Take the post-human shtick and those two far future factions locked in, well, a time war with one another. What did this actually amount to? Nothing much that I could make sense of. You're kind of given to understand that Red, or again was it Blue, doesn't really matter, is some sort of cyborg from a far future technocracy, cyberpunky hellscape, I don't freaking know, that was my guess, and that Blue is maybe some sort of plant person from a far future zoobotanical hive mind? That's what I'm going with. But it's not like I'm actually confident about this in the slightest, or that it properly matters for the story or its stakes either, beyond potentially the most superficial of technology v nature motifs. Then there's the supposed lesbian romance of it all. But I fail to see how this is even relevant when the story deals with post-humans from far future societies where sex doesn't seem to exist anymore in any meaningful sense of the concept, in human beings at least. Red and Blue were not birthed and do not have biological parents. At the very least, Red says this outright in the text, so I'm not entirely convinced they were even women in the human female sense of the word to begin with. I guess you could argue they inhabited sterile female bodies to blend into the human societies of the past, and that's good enough for this to count as a sapphic relationship, but I don't know. Methinks homosexual women deserve infinitely better in terms of emotionally resonant representation. The book's final chapters also got way too crazy with abstractions and senseless descriptions. You're told about vines binding planets, tree trunks in space, suns with eyes, and I was like, what? I couldn't tell you if the garden, Blue's faction, was an actual zoobotanical hive mind, which remains my best guess, an organic AI, or just, well, something else. The agency, Red's presumably more cyborg or cyberpunky, maybe, faction suffered from a similar lack of definition. And it honestly kind of sucks. Because, I don't know about you, but vines biting planets in outer space sounds pretty cool to me as an idea, if a tad far-fetched. But all of it was just so freaking opaque and undeveloped. None of it felt meaningful, awe-inspiring, or thought-provoking. So, again, what was the actual freaking point of including any of it, of making it science fiction, ultimately beyond mere fancy set dressing? Because really, it was all about the romance, and said romance literally could have been told, and quite frankly, better fleshed out, in a general fiction setting. Sue me. Okay, make it historical, I guess, for extra flavor if you must, but please, please, stop wasting the opportunities afforded by speculative genre writing like this. Speculative world-building in a story such as this one should, ideally, in my book, enhance its potential theming of love, yearning, desire, etc., or at least, I don't know, just provide something that will firmly engage or fine, simply entertain my SFF-loving mind. And honestly, the romance itself wasn't particularly good either. In fact, I'd argue the plot twist in this novella firmly catapulted it into bad territory, but I'll come back to this very shortly. So putting that aside for now, no, I didn't really buy into Red and Blue's romance. Now, it wasn't exactly a case of insta-love as such. I've definitely seen much worse. But there were two major issues with it for me. First, the book clearly didn't genuinely care about its speculative quality in any meaningful sense, but it still kinda had to fill a certain amount of pages with, often very confusing, SF-coded cutscenes, as it were, and nods to various strands of history Red and Blue were supposedly modifying across the multi-timeverse for the benefit of their respective factions. This then took time and care away from properly fleshing out their personalities and interest for one another beyond a, at the end of the day, rather superficial, we are both super smart outsiders with regards to each of our respective factions' motif. Second, there was a problem with the pacing and escalation of the love feels, and the pacing of the story more generally, to be honest. We essentially go from pleasant, frenemy banter to slightly deeper and earnestly curious personal inquiries to "You are my love across all the stars and oceans and multiverses and supernovas, and I will die for you, and I need to touch you and taste you, and it's sweet agony, oh my god!" I'm barely exaggerating. I went from feeling like Red and Blues was a decently pleasant and mildly relatable developing relationship to wincing from the over-the-topness of it all. Again, it's not quite insta-love, but it's still, ultimately, it kind of veers into that, where it's like, I don't know, infatuation too quickly in love? Whatever. Also, just don't call that love. In any case, call it what it is. Wild infatuation, which you'd think super advanced, super intelligent posthumans would be able to differentiate from actual love. But then perhaps the point here was that posthuman really means inhuman with the emotional intelligence of a 14-year-old. Either way, I hated it. No thank you. But then it gets worse because, wait for it, time travel! I mean, it is called This Is How We Lose the Time War. And to discuss that clusterfuck, I need to go into major plot spoilers, so skip ahead to my concluding remarks if you wish to avoid them. In 1, 2, 3... So, despite the fact this book didn't truly care as far as I'm concerned about its science-fictional nature, it still decided to pay a little extra mind to the fact it was actually supposed to be a sci-fi romance set during a time war, and to get a little extra muppety with a fat dollop of cheap as fuck, convenient as fuck, happy ending guaranteeing Deus Ex time travel. I can't stress enough how much I loathe that shit. This is precisely why you shouldn't freaking attempt time travel if you can't skillfully utilize it for narrative or theming purposes. Or emotional purposes, really, because what's hilarious about this novella is that it clearly felt to me like the time travel was meant to enhance the emotional impact of its romance. But I was like, nah, bestie, you ain't no Doc. Not even close. The book's time-traveling clincher felt so freaking cheap. And it cheapened the characters' relationship. Not that it was particularly convincing to begin with, mind you. Still, the time-traveling or time loop twist made it much worse because it kind of made Red and Blue biologically fated to be together. Kind of. With mixing of DNA, I guess, if these bitches even had DNA as we understand it. Which goes back to the fact the world building in this thing wasn't good at all. But so yes, the story essentially indulges in the fated mates trope, I think that's what it's called, which I found cheap and boring, and which I'd argue is pretty, well, inimical to illustrating believable and emotionally impactful bonds of actual love. But I suppose your mileage will vary with this, as always. Oh, and so the twist? So basically, and keeping in mind, I read this a few months ago now, Blue dies, leaves clues for Red that allow her to go into the garden, so Blue's faction, and there she finds the pod? Seed pod? Where Blue and others are being grown, I think, and she's Red injects, I don't know, proteins, antibodies, bits of her own DNA, like I said, shit like that, into Blue. So Red literally puts bits of herself into Blue, biologically speaking, which then allows Blue, back in the timeline she dies in, to metabolize the poison she took and, well, not die. Oh yeah, right. And there's also a thing where during most of the story, Blue and Red are being shadowed by a mysterious figure they think is a third agent sent to keep, well, tabs on them or something, but actually nope. It was Red all along, leaving breadcrumbs and doing, you know, that time travel thing where you have to ensure a certain timeline will unfold in a way that will make the overarching time loop stable, etc. You know, just classic tie yourself into knots time travel bullshit. And to be very clear, it's not like that stuff can't ever be done well. Again, Dark. Go watch it if you haven't already. It's well worth your time. But this thing most definitely wasn't it. And so Red and Blue finally defect from their respective factions so they can live happily ever after as based post-human lesbian lovers. Whatever. So yeah, wasn't a fan of any of that. Honestly, had the book simply left it at, we'll keep the SFness at mere aesthetics level, as I like to call it, and that's it, I would have considered This Is How You Lose the Time War mediocre to fine, worth reading once at least. But as it stands, I can't with the Muppety Deus Ex time travel bullshit. And the irremediably cheapened romance this led to. As a 3.5 to very weak 4 out of 10 read, it was an absolute waste of time. I really shouldn't have bothered purchasing, and one of the worst things I read last year. Oh well, live and learn, as they say. At least it was short, even very short. And that concludes my review of This Is How You Lose the Time War, co-written by Amal El-Notar and Max Gladstone. I hope you found it interesting, engaging, enjoyable, you know, all the usual good things. And on that very final note, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves, and, you know, thank you for watching, and I shall see you all at some point in another video, but until then, bye-bye.